Hello, welcome everyone to the opening day of the Cartooning Ukraine exhibition. We're starting with a talk show, and then we'll also have some other events, but everyone, welcome for the talk show for now. Everyone who is here and everyone else who is watching online. So we all know that the world is at this moment suffering for the war that is happening in Ukraine, and but it's very difficult for any of us to like have the same perspective with the people of Ukraine, who are at this moment suffering the most. They are under the bombs, and there is like the military expansion of Putin's Russia, and we've seen everything in TV or newspapers. But sometimes, more than news or more than media, we really need to depend on artistic works, especially cartoons. When we look back to the history of the world, Second World War or First World War, or like also many wars that we've seen in the last couple of decades, the cartoon sometimes often tells us like more than what TV or any other kind of political representation tells us, and that's what is also my feeling about today's event and the exhibition that is happening. Uh, I guess you all have spent some time to look into the cartoons. Many of this cartoon actually reminds me of also like some cartoons from the Second World War, and it feels like sometimes some dangerous moments, critical moments, comes back, and it also becomes necessary for us to take critical decisions in this kind of moments. And I guess this is why we gathered here today to reflect on these cartoons and to reflect on this historical moment that we're passing through. And at the same time, to know more and create more awareness about the situation in Ukraine. And this exhibition is based on this publication that is known as Cartooning Ukraine. Ronald Boss is here. He's the editor of this publication. Ronald is a writer and also a documentary filmmaker. And as you can see that he also does certain kind of publications. Before this one, there was one on Ukraine, cartooning Syria. Oh. The previous, there was another publication called Cartooning Syria. You can see it over there. So I'm actually going to ask Ronald about when he was doing these publications, what was in his mind, and what was also his experience of doing it, and what ideas he wanted to disseminate to the society here.
Good evening. This exhibition started, of course, after the war started in Ukraine. And before, I had this exhibition on Syrian cartoonists. And it happened because the Russians took part in the war, or the civil war, or the revolution, as you like to call it, I don't know. And they started to bomb over there. And at that moment, I wanted to give some attention to what happened there. The public attention was already a little bit gone away. Everybody thought it is over. And then I started this exhibition 5 years ago. And on the 24th of February, I spoke with one of the Syrian cartoonists about what to do, what's next. And then we decided to ask, or to look for Ukrainian cartoonists. And I didn't know one of them. I got one address, and in short time I discovered there were about, well, I think there were about more than this, but we have discovered 14 people who are drawing these cartoons, and most of them, they have the intention to support the resistance in Ukraine. So I don't know exactly what they were doing before, but after 24th of February, and some of them already after the Russian aggression in 2014, after the Maidan revolution, they started to make these cartoons. But it really came to a big explosion of cartoons after 24th of this year. And I slowly came in contact with all of them. So they are publishing their work on Facebook, on Instagram. There you can find them. And I through one of them, I got in contact with all of them. So they all sent their cartoons, the ones they wanted to have in this exhibition. And so that's how they are here. And this exhibition is traveling. It's easy to take to transport them, and it was already in some other villages in the Netherlands. So now it's the first time in Amsterdam.
Thank you. I would also like to ask you one more question, at least, which is you did first the cartooning Syria project, now then the cartooning Ukraine, like almost one after another. So it kind of shows like we're living in a time of almost constant war, like two big war in a very short time. And what's your feeling about living in this specific period of time and like looking into it from a perspective as a artist, as a documentary filmmaker, and also as a publisher, how you're trying to archive this time, like through cartoon, you're archiving this like this time through cartooning, both Syria and then Ukraine, and what is your like feeling about this time, this specific historic period, and also your work, how you're thinking about like what do you think like you're actually doing like by cartooning?
Well, I think this is my way of supporting. This is well, some people go to Ukraine and take people here, and other people take people in home, and this is what I could do. You feel in this time of war, you feel a little what is it, powerless. So this is a way of supporting on a very small level, but to support the cartoonists. And it was the same with the Syrian. They were not connected, so they had their own individual exhibitions. And this is it's about the same with the Ukrainians. They have their they take part in a lot of international contests with their cartoons at the moment, and they are published a lot in international newspapers. But all together, that's not something they do themselves. So that's the special thing about this exhibition. And I could, of course, try to make a documentary, but at this moment, I do this.
No, thank you, I understand. What you're saying, like during the time of war, we do feel powerless, and the powerless can do something by creating art or by creating cartoons. They do also do some important fight.
Yes.
Especially for the future, when people would look back, they would actually look back in this kind of archives way more than any other different kind of small things that we look into now. And it's much easier for people to understand history and to see the heroes and villains of the history.
And in the little booklets that we published, you can also find a short article of one of the Ukrainian writers, and they also they say at this moment we cannot write novels, but we have to support the resistance. And Kurkov is traveling around in Europe and making a lot of effort. And there's another one, it's called Zadan, and he is also trying to get financial support to support the army. He's especially doing that, and he is also giving concerts. He's also a pop musician, and he's giving concerts and trying to support the military resistance. So that's what they see as a duty for artists in a time of war. Not, I think one of the cartoonists is in the army, but most of them they support in this way.
Yes, I saw one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I saw there was one cartoonist who was also fighting at this moment. That was yeah, interesting. Actually, I would. Oh, if you want to have something, go on.
Yes, I wanted to say all of them they still live in Ukraine, except two of them. One of them is Anna Savira. Her works are here, and she's living in Berlin, but she was already living before the war in Berlin, and she has also an international career. And the other one is one of the eldest. It's Vladimir Kazanevsky, and he was already in Slovakia, and he's still living there and doing exhibitions in Europe at the moment.
Thank you. We do really like Anna's cartoons. That's why we wanted to put it there, so that everybody can see them. But thank you, Ronald. I would like to ask you one more question, and then if you want to add something to it. So the question is, I was actually talking to probably Katerina about, like, first you did the cartooning Syria, now you're having to do cartooning Ukraine. These are heavy work. And we were like, I was telling, I don't want Ronald to do another cartooning project. But how do you see yourself? This is a fight. We're living in a bad time. And just because we can't, if we say we don't want to see war, or we don't want another cartooning project. But, I mean, who knows? I mean, we don't know where the world is heading. But what are you hoping or looking forward to about the future?
Well, I don't look forward for another cartooning, but at this moment it would be very useful to do a cartooning Iran. You know, with what's happening in Iran, there's a lot of resistance at the moment. Or there's more places in the world cartooning Sudan. Why not? But I'm looking forward to the end of the war, of course.
No, thank you. I mean, yes, it would be much interesting to move from war to like a revolutionary movement that is happening in Iran. There haven't been a lot of attention to it apart from the first few days. But yeah, good luck. I'd be looking forward to cartooning Iran project. Okay. If you want to add something, then please.
No, that's it.
Cool. Thank you, Ronald. And good luck for the future endeavor for maybe cartooning Iran and Syria. Iran and Sudan project. Thank you. Okay, everyone. Now we are going to move to a poetry, which would be recited by Victoria. This poetry is the last couple of sentences of this poetry really caught my eyes, and I've been thinking about it. So the poet is Lina Kostenko. She is a famous poet, and I'm looking forward to listening to the recitation of Victoria.
І жах, і кров, і смерть, і відчай, і клекіт хижої орди. Маленький сірий чоловічок накоїв чорної біди. Це звір огидної породи, лохнес холодної Неви. Куди ж ви дивитесь, народи? Сьогодні ми, а завтра ви. It's us today. Tomorrow you.
Thank you. Do nations wait for fierce preacher? That sentence, it really like forces us to ponder about it. But thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Ronald. Would like to move into the next session of this event today, which is a talk show with Maria, Anastasia, and Katerina. So would be nice if you guys can join us here. Okay. So welcome, Maria, Anastasia, and Katerina. Thanks to all of you for being here today. And I would start the discussion with Maria, who is a PhD student. She's the founder chair of Opera Foundation. And I would actually would like to ask you about the current condition of the Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and also maybe in Netherlands, since you are like active here, and maybe also in Amsterdam or New West for those of us who lives here. What are the like main difficulties that the Ukrainian migrants, refugee migrants, are facing at this moment in this situation, in this war-torn situation, and specifically here in Netherlands or in Amsterdam? Sorry, especially in Netherlands and in Amsterdam.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that and opportunity to talk about it. Maybe I was, before answering to your question, maybe going back a bit to what happened just now. There was a poem by a very famous Ukrainian poetess. And I think the sense of this poem was that we would keep fighting. If we don't fight, then somebody else is going to take over. And I think that's a bit important to also reflect what Lina Kosenko means to us, I think Ukrainians. And I think she's one of the most, I would say, last dissidents living in Ukraine, those who were fighting for the independence during the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly why her poem was chosen for this exhibition, because she was the one who was fighting for independence while it was almost impossible. And I think coming back to your question is that like the resistance and the way, of course, I mean, nobody chose to come here. And although people do believe that Ukrainians were welcomed very well, which I agree, they were welcomed it seems like way better, because there was a lot of support from also civil society. Temporary directive by itself is not necessarily like I would say, there are some things that make it more as a temporary solution. So the way we look at the temporary stay should be temporary. That's where it comes from. And also, we don't know whether the welcoming part comes from the temporary part or not. And I think that this is exactly what people are facing now, is uncertainty. So if when you have an asylum status or refugee status, then you know what is going to happen. But here you don't know. So every year you have to make new plans or not make plans. And for some people, there is nowhere to go to. So you have to make plans. But the legal situation doesn't allow you to make plans. So although it seems in the beginning, it seemed that everything was very pink and interesting, it was also very connected with the idea of like, oh, 2 weeks will pass and then they will just go home. Or there will be a victory. So now we come to a new phase where I think we have to deal with the reality that we have to provide the infrastructure. So people understand that they have to stay longer, then we have to have opportunity for them to learn the language, to actually survive, and not just think about next 2 months, but think about at least for next year, how to plan this next year. For children, they need to integrate in schools and find Dutch friends and not to get stuck with Ukrainian friends whose all fathers are fighting. So I think that we are now in the process where we have to switch from basically crisis mode to the long-term mode, and crisis mode is very emotional. So now I think the emotions go away, and it's time to actually see whether emotions were really true and whether they can last longer than 3 months. So I think this is a bit maybe not the actually current situation that everybody can in a way Google, I think, but it's more about what is accompanying this situation and what challenges are we facing now in the basically in policy sphere. Yeah.
Is there any specific challenges that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think that this is the biggest challenge is long-term policy. It's also pretty much connects with the fact what is going to happen in Ukraine, but the level of destruction is quite big. That means that people have to, yeah, live two lives in a way, here and there. And since the families are mostly separated, then you also have to find a way how to build your family relationship again, how you speak with your father, with your family, with your grandmother, who are actually having to survive winter now, especially. So I think that, yeah, politically speaking, this will be the main challenge, how we do it, how we actually can provide long-term policies and come out of this temporary state, or maybe finding some kind of hybrid solutions where we think about Ukraine in the terms of integrating it in the EU more and more, and then the border by itself will not exist, and it already doesn't exist because people can travel, and it's also something we can learn as well for any other migrants, because my research is focused on Nigerian migrants mostly, and one of the biggest, I think, challenges is that we have borders people have to cross, right? So here we can see what happens when there is no border, and maybe this is something also that we can apply, this understanding of like you can actually cross the border and it will be fine, and people can find job and they can survive. It doesn't mean they still cannot be helped and shouldn't be helped, which we have to help. But I think that's exactly what can be applied for other situations, to find this hybrid open solution where people can see their families back home, but actually work here and be also useful for society, and we have enough abilities and capabilities to also build life here and not just have all the time this idea of like the next month, I don't know what to do anymore. Yeah.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I mean, there are like what you're saying here now. This is something that we like face pretty regularly when it comes to the refugee situations in Europe, because there is always this trouble of being a refugee, but at the same time having a connection and connection with your country, with your family, with your friends and society. You start having two life, and then you either have to like focus in more onto one, which is mainly here. But obviously, when it comes to a war situation or a political situation, people who has to leave, they kind of also carry a kind of responsibility and duty towards their own community. And also they leave a lot of like close people back at home. So, but I am very curious about when you're saying like this can be also helpful for others, not just for Ukrainians. I mean, this is a very interesting thing that you mentioned, like about crossing the borders. We know that the European borders have, EU borders have kind of expanded outside of the border when it comes to like controlling migration. We know that there are like external border in the Middle East to stop migrants from crossing the like crossing the sea. So there are like, but this is also kind of shows us how the borders have become volatile. The strict border no longer functions as it used to be. But so my question is like, do you see like there's a big change happening also with this Ukraine war? But at the same time, we know that like nations stood, like there's a lot of political movements in many countries in Europe and like everywhere to strengthen the nation-state border. What is going to happen? Are the nation-state border going to become more and more flexible and disappear more, or they're going to come back with like, you know, more visibility? What do you think?
Well, I think we are, if you think that EU is a nation, well, I don't think so, it's not. So yeah, and there are no borders inside. And as for the border with the Ukraine, well, I think in the end there was inevitable. So this is about moral decision. This is like Lebanon. So we have never been experiencing Lebanon in the Netherlands, right? But this is what happened. And when Syrian crisis happened, People were just moving. They were just fleeing. They were just taking their stuff and going to Lebanon. It's only afterwards that people made a huge movement. But that's a bit different story. That I think here, it was just there were no choice. So I'm curious what would happen if Ukrainians would be somewhere as far as Syria, whether we will be as welcoming. I think that it was also a bit of no other choice because Poland, we are very connected with Ukraine. They also suffered from Russian colonialism and as well as Baltic states. So for them, supporting Ukraine was as supporting themselves. So that was no question about it. So that's why how the border actually disappeared. And I think that Europe just had no other choice than opening it. And I think that this is a bit what we can learn is that we can manage open borders, I think. And that's where the beauty comes. So basically that if you open that you are not getting too overwhelmed and that is possible to manage it. But I think that, like, again, coming back to resilience and resistance, I think that a lot of people are also like looking around, you can see that this also shows the resilience and the possibility, not only people when they're coming here, they also do a lot for their counterparts back in Ukraine. So there are a lot of movements and people, I have studied migration, I think my whole life, basically, my professional life, it has been 8 years. But I have never seen that unity that I saw with Ukrainian diaspora and people who are coming to help back at home and to self-organize and to actually manage the political decisions, the policy-making decisions. And I think that in this way, no matter what, I think if there are right mechanism, if there is, it's something that Europe can actually learn from, how you can manage the crisis when the borders are open, how people themselves can be resilient and help each other and themselves in a way, how those who are staying here taking responsibility for those going back or are staying in the Netherlands. So I think that, yeah, we can learn a lot from this situation, not only from a political side of border opening, but also from resilience, from courage of how people behaved and handle it. And this is, and also even for, like Ukraine has a lot of problems, but it's also the fact what we have now in Ukraine, the fighting part also shows Ukraine has a wonderful democratic values that they're fighting for, and they are getting against this whole like 300 years of fighting. So I think that these all things kind of something we can learn from Ukrainian crisis, let's say in Europe, not only in the perspective of political externalization of borders and everything, which is also good to reflect on how we manage borders. But yeah, I'm trying to also bring it more to the like different lessons that we can learn from basically Ukrainian community here. And that is also pretty much reflected in all of these beautiful cartoons or illustrations.
Thank you. That was very illuminating. I would like to ask you one last question. After that, if you want, you can also add, which is you just mentioned that there is a lot to learn from this, from the Ukrainian migrants and also their resilience, their struggle, or like how they are looking into the border in a time of survival and struggle. So I'm just wondering, have you used this Ukrainian people's movement as a case study, or like if you haven't, like how do you plan on disseminating or like these ideas and like also make other people like non-Ukrainian also look into it, including EU, and to learn and reflect something from it? Like how do we actually? What would be the easiest way to really look into it?
What do you mean by movements? You mean volunteering movements when people are helping each other, or like
Yes.
generally political situation that
No,
appear to
the people.
people.
Yeah. To look into them like as a like a case study, what we can learn from them, not just EU, like everyone in this time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think this is exactly what Anastasia is studying now. But I think that overall that I think that the first maybe what we have to start with is to see them as one of us. So I think that I will tell something from my own professional experience is that you become, as a Ukrainian scholar, suddenly you become a Ukrainian scholar and not a scholar. And I think that's first thing that we have to kind of give up, that the fact that, yeah, I am Ukrainian scholar, but I'm a scholar. And that's either you're a scholar or an activist. So, or you have actually, we give a platform only for refugees, but what if you, and then we organize something for refugees, we make them speak, but what if you are a refugee next day in Germany? Would you want to be heard just because you're a refugee and because you're German, but also because you had certain education in, for example, I don't know, policy making or university, or if you're a good businessman or if you're a good teacher? And I think that seeing people as it would be me the next time, and this is a professional as you, as yourself or as myself, I think that that's the first lesson that we can learn, because one of the biggest or like the reactions I saw or heard from Ukrainian people was, we are not refugees, just don't label us like that. And I think that also shows pretty much how we label refugees. So that means that it was scary for people that I will be labeled this way. And I think that, and also I can, for my own experience, when I visited Ukraine in August, it was my first time because I've not been living in Ukraine the last 8 years, like only visiting my family. And then when I came back, I was also thinking like, okay, I don't want to share any pain and anything that I saw there. Like at this moment, I want to be a migration scholar. And this is my thing. This is my pain. I don't want to scream about it. I don't want to do activism about it. It's actually, I won't like to do research, like proper academic research, but yeah, I don't want to scream from platforms just about my experience in Ukraine. And I think that this is also shows that what we do by refugee movements, by focusing a lot of attention on refugees, we also kind of make their identity being built only through trauma. Actually, you have to be listened to because you went through that experience. But what if I don't want to share about this experience? How much we actually ask people how much they want to share about their refugee stories. And knowing, being anthropologists working with migrants, I can say not everybody wants to. Because the thing is that others, not everybody, some people do, some people don't, and it's fine. So you can also just finish your master's or become an artist or become an anthropologist and share other experiences, your own, but not necessarily make that your identity. And I think that this, what maybe I had to learn myself, and this is something that I know that many Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian refugees would also love to hear, that there can be professionals, their background or their life could be valued here. We can learn from them not just because of their lived experience of trauma, but we can actually learn from them because they have cultural experience that we don't have. They have pain that they manage to manage so many crises throughout their life. In Ukraine, basically, we have crisis after crisis, so our crisis management is perfect. And you can see how also people start fighting together and how they organize these movements. That's also because they knew how to manage crisis for now years and years and years and years. And when the crisis happened in the Netherlands, nobody knew what to do for 2 months. And meanwhile, Ukrainian organizations, self-organized groups, like our own organization started like this, but if you look at, there was no food, I remember, in one of the centers in Amsterdam, and Ukrainians are really used to hot food for lunch. And of course, if you suddenly have children and you get a peanut butter sandwich, that was a disaster, especially the first days. And somehow people found the borscht and they started bringing Ukrainian soup to the centers every day for 2 weeks. They were cooking it for people who came. And only afterwards, the administration of the city of Amsterdam were like, yeah, I think that nobody eats that sandwiches. We need to change something. So you can imagine that this way of reacting to crisis, this is something we can learn. It's like, it's immediate. And nobody was waiting here that it will be done for you. People were just doing it. And when we once asked the question, like, why have you been doing it what you did with Aurora? We were like, yeah, we just didn't wait for it. So we took all vacation for 2 months to be able to help people, and we just did it. All of us, like there were 40 of us. So I think that this is something we can learn, and that can be transferred also for other refugees, that they can be using their skills of crisis management, of professionalism, of hospitality, of actually organizing events, also because they are good in organizing events and not just because they're refugees who organize the events. But yeah, that's it.
No, thank you. This is very illuminating. I mean, I was actually thinking about how difficult it is, actually. I mean, to say, okay, I'm not going to do it as a Ukrainian scholar, but as a scholar. I mean, to tell you the truth, I kind of support Hannah Arendt when she said that if you're attacked as a Jew, you have to like fight back as a Jew. I kind of believe it. I mean, even though I'm not really much into identity, but if I'm being attacked for a particular of my one identity that I somehow carry with my name or with my culture or from my family, then I suddenly like get into that identity. I uphold it. It's very difficult to not do it, especially when you are being oppressed. So I understand it's very difficult. Actually, yeah, if you want to comment something on that, can you do it briefly? Because then we're going to move to Anastasia. Thank
I
you.
will just comment on the identity part. I think when I said before, I could say, well, I'm Ukrainian scholar, it was no problem. Now you're a Ukrainian scholar, meaning you're biased and emotional when you're talking about something. And this is a problem. And I think that's what I was talking about. So it doesn't mean giving up my identity. No, I think my identity is still as Ukrainian scholar, and it has been like this for the last 8 years. Although, like, yeah, at this moment, even difficult to say, okay, am I Dutch or Ukrainian scholar? But okay, but that is a different part. But the identity of me being a refugee or not a refugee, Ukrainian or a scholar, so this is not something that's like, I don't want the trauma to become a part of my identity. And that's different. So it's okay to be, for yourself, Bangladeshi activist, right? But it's not that I'm Bangladeshi refugee activist, and refugee is the most important part here. And then everything that you're talking about is kind of look through these eyes, even when you at this moment don't want that. And I think that's where it comes from. So like the leaving identity, that would never be my goal. But I also think that that's what also was mentioned by the speaker before when he said, we all feel that we are responsible for our countries. We all feel that we want to be part of something. We want to fight at this moment, but it doesn't mean that we are kind of getting in this mode of like emotions leading our way. It's more about our expression of how we feel, but it doesn't kind of make a trauma a necessary part of it. These people who are doing here, they're also just wonderful artists who have been doing it for their whole life. And then now they use this gift that they have to tell the story. And I think this is a bit what everyone tries to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would now go to Anastasia, who is also a PhD researcher, an anthropologist. Anastasia works on post-colonial and decolonial theories, and I would like to ask Anastasia about the Russian expansionism and imperialism. Like, I know that you look into it as a colonial power, or Russian expansion as a colonial expansion, and as a country, Ukraine as a country, just next to the border of Russia, they are one of the countries that fails it more than many other countries. So, can you explain us like why you frame Russia as a colonial power, and what are the reasons? I mean, for everyone, so that we can all understand. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So conversation about colonialism and decolonial can be really like metaphysical and philosophical. So I'm just gonna try to maybe talk in more simpler terms about it. And first of all, we can look at coloniality or what it is on macro levels and in micro levels. And in the macro levels, Russian coloniality, and yeah, by the way, before I start talking about coloniality, Russian and Moscow imperial coloniality, it's not just about Ukraine. Now we're going to talk about Ukraine, but it's also about all the like Siberian countries, Tatarstan, Dagestan, Chechnya. It's also about other wars Russia initiated, not only in Syria, but in Georgia and in many like post-socialist states. So it's really important to understand that it's much, much bigger than Ukraine. But when we're talking about, when we would talk about Russian coloniality in Ukraine, there are so many books written about 300 years of Russian colonization. First, it's Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, which was basically a replica of the Russian Empire. We can talk about how Moscow was milking Ukraine, about all the resources that were human resources, just other resources, how much money, produce were just brought to Moscow. We can talk about genocides. We can talk about mass displacements. We can talk about all the laws that banned Ukrainian language, Ukrainian books. We can talk about the repressions in the 30s, in the 60s. Yeah, but also we can talk about the coloniality on a micro level, and sort of by micro level, I mean the coloniality that is just embodied in all of us, in sort of subjectivities and lived experiences, and it's really apparent through language. Yeah, and it's probably everyone knows that in Ukraine, people both speak Russian and Ukrainian, but how Russian coloniality is embodied in language is that Ukrainian language is always, and people who speak Ukrainian language or Ukrainians in general, they're always perceived like inferior, more stupid, more weaker to the Russians, though the Russian often label Ukrainian language as sort of lamb language or funny language, village language. And it's something maybe really unfamiliar, surprising. I see that you're surprised. But yeah, if you would ask any Ukrainians, I don't know, even before Maidan revolution, even after, speaking Ukrainian was for some people, for many people, it was just like something uncomfortable. You have to be really courageous to speak Ukrainian because it was not simply considered cool. And we can look at the Russian popular culture, Russian TV shows, where Ukrainians were portrayed as just this like village, naive, funny looking people that spoke funny, that were like a bit stupid. So yeah, and maybe this is all, it's not as bad as like what's happening now, but in the filtration camps, Russians used the same logic. If you're like show any sympathy towards Ukraine, if you speak Ukrainian, if you have like Ukrainian symbolic, some flags, you may not pass filtration. So this is just examples of what coloniality can be, and the important thing about like colonial theory in post-Soviet is that it was largely ignored by many Western scholars who were with colonial and decolonial scholarship, but it was not non-existent, and it did not occur just now as a response to the war. This is sentiment. It occurred in the 90s. There were some scholars like Spivak who was engaging with Ukrainian scholars, mainly of the West, about whether it's apt to apply post-colonial theories to post-Soviet area. So it's a broad scholarship, and yeah, but just some of the Western scholars don't know about it. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And yeah, so maybe we could think, why is it important to label colonial Russian imperial violence as colonial? First point, I would say that this helps us to sort of find a common language with Euro-American scholars, with the English-speaking world, sort of to explain the power dynamics between Russia and Ukraine, explain the power dynamics in the former USSR. It could even explain how Russian metropolis, how Moscow relates to Siberia, to North Caucasus, to Dagestan, and to all the non-Moscow, non-St. Petersburg regions of the Russia. So I think it's a really vocabulary of coloniality is just the vocabulary familiar for the Western scholarship. And if we apply it to Ukrainian case or post-Soviet case, it really helps us to understand better. Second point is that, well, I say apply, but maybe it's a mistake because we don't just sort of apply, I don't know, British colonialism or Dutch colonialism to Ukrainian case or Soviet case, Russian case. We just not just apply like Latin American colonization to Ukrainian case. Of course, these are different forms of colonization, and simply applying those theories to Ukraine and to post-Soviet would be negligence. We just have to, again, look at those scholars who already were working with colonial theories, not only scholars, artists, writers, Oksana Zabushko, for example, and I think it would really enrich Western scholarship about coloniality, decoloniality, and post-colonial scholarship. And because coloniality is does not tied to a specific region or a specific territory. I look at coloniality and many other scholars as sort of this shape-shifting phenomena. So coloniality is just a blueprint for domination and violence. And if we look at it exactly like that, not something tied to a historical era, geographical era, specific location, race or ethnicity, but something as a desire to subjugate and dominate, we can actually, yeah, I think it would be really fruitful for the general conversation. And my third point about why is it important to label Russian imperial violence as colonial violence is that it's, so I think Ukrainians been struggling, especially before the 2014, before the war started. It was really hard to sort of still living under large Russian colonial influence. It was really hard to place yourself. Why do I feel inferior when I speak Ukrainian? Why everyone knows about Russia, no one knows about Ukraine? Why Russia has like, yeah, there are so many Russophiles of Russian culture, why Russian poets, musicians, ballerinas are so popular and no one knows about Ukraine, and all of those things. And why this war happened, why Crimea happened, why war in 2014 happened, why Russia is so present in Ukraine. And it was really hard, it is really hard maybe for some people to sort of place our traumas. And I think that understanding coloniality just helps to sort of process our colonial historical traumas. And yeah, without acknowledging what's been done to you historically in a subjective level, like why my great grandma was shot by, he was in a PA army by Soviet soldiers. Those things, those family history, it's easier to understand and sort of categorize and come to peace when you have this like sort of colonial, I don't want to even say scholarship, just when you use those terms or those vocabulary, and without acknowledging what happened, without even like Russian elites acknowledging that this violence is colonial violence. It's not just happened now because of Putin. It has long history. Without them acknowledging their role in it, it's really hard to come to terms. It's really hard to move further when you don't understand what happened. And I think the colonial vocabulary, colonial writing, colonial art, decolonial and post-colonial really helps us to do that.
Thank you, Anastasia. I also do agree with you. I mean, it's also like an area of, I mean, decoloniality is also like one of my research area. Although I mainly, I agree with you, like when you talk about colonialization or colonialism, we mainly talk about certain region mainly, like the global south mainly, Indian subcontinent, South Africa and South America mostly. But I personally also believe that the blueprint of colonization or the like structure, the structure of colonial power, it can manifest in many parts of the world. I mean, we rarely talk about the kind of colonial form of oppression that the Irish people have faced, and not just the Irish people. You're elaborating on Ukraine. To tell you the truth, when my face looked surprised, it was mainly because I found some similarities of me as a Bangladeshi person in the South Asia, India on the third side. I mean, even in New West, when I go to an Indian shop just to buy spices, they expect me to speak Hindi without even like caring that I might not be from India, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that can, so it's not about like only European people would like colonize in some other countries, and or like if there is no European population who doesn't get colonized by much powerful nations. I mean, during the Second World War, the Nazi Germany actually wanted to like colonize the whole like eastern region. So these are the part of history we tend to forget, and we don't also like don't compare with here and the global south and look for the common zone of oppression at the same time, common zone of struggling back. So I'm really glad that you brought this up. But then I'm going to ask you a little difficult question, although we don't have a lot of time to really talk about it, which is, I mean, if we look into the history of colonization, I always found it like very interesting, like me being from a country that was colonized by the West. And so like when I look into our history, anti-colonial movement and nationalism work together, hand in hand. But when you look into Europe, nationalism and imperialism and colonial expansion work hand in hand. So there is this weird relationship with nationalism and colonialism, sometimes nationalism and anti-colonialism. But one thing we're seeing that the whole nation-state system that we have established around the world, which have went through several evolution in the last few hundred years to give us a system that works, but we're seeing that the system really doesn't work. They're like one sovereign state colonizing another sovereign state just because it has more weapons and more money, and its government is a much powerful mafia. I'll say it like this: I really don't like nation state anymore because I don't want, I don't want to go into my own political view, but so I'm like, how do you think, what can we learn from Ukraine, which is a country in Eastern Europe, right now, facing the Russian operation, the Russian colonization, but also historically faced West European expansion and colonization too. So this vantage point that you can have, this specific location, being in Europe, it has this vantage point of reminding the Europe about this, what colonial expansion does, what nationalist expansionism and jingoism does when it becomes a colonial force, and how the countries they're fighting, countries and nations fighting against colonial expansion from a decolonial and post-colonial perspective. What Ukraine can show us, or what you think as a scholar, what do you want to see from Ukraine that can actually give all of us something new, like a new light beyond this darkness that we're facing right now?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, so we previously with you had some conversation about nationalism, but maybe we're gonna go in a different direction. Yeah, so maybe if you started talking about how nationalism is connected to the colonial, post-colonial, anti-colonial movements, it's good to say, and you asked what new can it give us, and I would say that the first thing that we can sort of decolonize or deconstruct our ideas about what nationalism is and what nation state is, and what are the relationship with nationalism and nation state. And I think that's what I studied.
Sorry. I'm just going to add one more question line, because then it would be much more complete. Sorry. The thing is, I actually also wanted to ask you, I think I told you at that day, because this is also part of my own research. Because what I experienced is, when there is anti-colonial movement or liberation movement, it is built up on people's voice. It is built up on people's struggle. But the nation state or the government, they promise to represent those people, but they never manage to represent them. They represent certain class or certain kind of, mafia government. That's what we are seeing pretty much, apart from some very few successful countries, maybe, that has a stable democracy and everything. So, this all, people have always been contributing to liberation, contributing in the anti-colonial movement, but then their own voice that is removed when we're building up national state polity. How do you think we can go beyond that? And what do you think for Ukraine, what would be the options and what we can learn from that? That's all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, that's gonna help me to narrow down my question. So if we're gonna talk about Ukrainian nationalism, I think that's something that Europe could learn from Ukrainian nationalism. Is it's really different from, of course, Western nationalism. It's really different from Dutch nationalism or American nationalism. It's it has little connections with certain political movements like far-right agenda, or it has little connection with anti-immigrant or racist sentiments. And Ukrainian nationalism, despite some opinions that I heard during this last almost a year, is that it's only rising now. Ukrainians are only active this now, but Ukrainian nationalism has a really, really long history. And of course, Ukrainian nationalism was always it existed because we were repressed by Russia, by Russian Empire, by the Soviet Union, and I don't think Ukrainian people, they are really sort of maybe it's really sort of populist and statement, but they're really free-loving nation, and we have no trouble. Ukrainian civic society is really strong. If you're saying that there are some politician who's gonna sort of feed on Ukrainian nationalist sentiment and then not gonna represent them properly, we have no problems of throwing over dictators like in 2014, in 2004. Of course, there are a lot of problems with corruption. There are a lot of problems with oligarchy, but that's the same as everywhere. I don't think that the nationalism is something that gonna help. I don't know if there are any connections between nationalism and representation in the government. And I think the important thing about Ukrainian nationalism, it's not connected to, as I said, it's not connected to leftist or left-winging or far-winging movements. It's not connected to the king, queen, or president or government. It's not connected to religion. There are leftist nationalists, there are queer nationalists, there are feminist nationalists. Just Ukrainian people identify as nationalists. It's quite something different from what you expect from like Dutch nationalists or American nationalists. So yeah, I would say that it would be really useful for us to sort of deconstruct our ideas about what does it mean to just to love the place where you live. And you talked about that we could move from more borderless society, from the societies where like identity and nation does not play a big role. But unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen in the nearest future. Maybe it can happen in Europe, where there are not so much problems between Netherlands and Germany, or Germany and France. But it certainly cannot happen if Russia still exists in the present form. If there's going to be and if this violence is going to end, but Russia is going to exist in the same form that it's now, the war can happen, the same war in 10 or 20 years. So there's still going to be a need for Ukrainian nationalism. And by Ukrainian nationalism, I mean just like preserving your culture, your language, protecting it, and remembering the violence that was done to it, to people, to your language, to your culture. It's not about excluding people. It's not about deciding. It's not about far-right values. It's not about creating like borders with other nations. Ukraine is pretty much leaning towards European Union, towards democratic values. That's why we're, that's why the war is happening. So I can go on and on, but maybe you can.
No, I was actually just going to tell you that, this is something I would like to hear for like an hour or something and talk about, like have more discussion, but we unfortunately don't have the time. I mean, but I really liked what you were saying, like kind of articulating or at least imagining a kind of nationhood, or that is beyond the kind of older classical identity-based ideology. So yeah, it would be nice to have a post-ideological idea of nationhood, I guess. But maybe we'll talk about that some other day. We don't have much time now, and I would like to move to Katerina, who is an artist. And I wanted to ask Katerina about, I mean, there's a lot of Ukrainian artists at this moment who are living in Europe and also in Netherlands. And war is a very difficult time for any artist, or whether it's a writer or a painter or a cartoonist. At the same time, there is something they want to do, certain kind of responsibility, even as an artist. But at the same time, an artist, when they are maybe becoming migrant or like become refugee, moving into somewhere else, or like living in a war condition with constant bombing and people dying, like it's a traumatic situation. How would you elaborate the condition of the like Ukrainian artists now there, and also those who migrated?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the question, and I really enjoyed listening to Maria and Anastasia. So maybe I will also elaborate a little bit, like connecting the art situation with what was mentioned about the migration and about the colonial situation, like acknowledging the fact that we are post-colonial state, because it was kind of a little bit hidden from us. We learned that we became independent, but no one actually talked about it. And I'm so glad that so many studies in academia is like so broader, and it's also reflected in their artistic practice a lot. But talking particularly about the situation with artists, what the artists experience, it's also really complicated because there are like two categories of artists who, actually even three categories. People who stayed in Ukraine and suffer from the time to time bombings and this constant threat of nuclear bombing and a shortage of electricity and everything what can happen to a person basically. There are artists who moved somewhere else in Europe and even farther in Europe. Looks like they have electricity, they have water, they have kind of a better condition, but on the other hand, some of the artists that I know, they like in these 8 months, they changed 6 places where they stayed. I have no idea how you can create anything if you have a constant need to search for a new place to live. So basically, you're kind of relieved from the threatening situation, but on the other hand, you're constantly in this homeless position, asking people around, learning how to find place, and it's not so easy, especially if we talk about Amsterdam, for instance. There are more institutions in Amsterdam that can help you as an artist, but the housing situation is just horrible for everyone, not only for the people who had to flee Ukraine, but like we know experience it for years, right? And there are people who actually traveling around Europe, coming back to Ukraine, going back to Europe, also like always on the road. They combine both situations. But I must say it also changed over time, and was Maria saying like it goes in phases, and now I think we enter into a different phase because of course in a path of 8 months like everything changes, right? So like there is kind of emotions that you as a person cannot experience the same emotions for such a long time, right? So then becomes a bit kind of the emotional stability. You stuck in one in one mental state. But on the other hand, there is also this acknowledgement how you can use the situation. And for a lot of artists, I know that when everything happened on 24th of February, it was a shock. It was an immediate need to document. And a lot of people, as Kurkov, for instance, like he stopped writing novels, but he was constantly writing some notes, like just not to forget. Because when you check how many things happened in the first week, it's incredible. When you check like even time, like every 2 hours something happened because Ukraine is huge and it was entirely bombed, and then the invasion from the north, and then occupation in the south. And then you think about it, just in 1 week, it was such a crazy situation for everyone. So like the first immediate reaction from the artists, from the writers, was just to document in order not to forget anything. And I know a lot of people who were just posting constantly on Instagram, on Twitter, just to have the history. And then I think there was also a discussion among the Ukrainian artists who stayed in Ukraine, like questioning, should we just reflect? Should we just tweet? Like, should we be a tweeter ourselves? Because like, how is it happening? Like, we're making sketches, we're making the diaries, but what's happening? We have no time to process, we have no time to reflect. And then the art is always a reflection. It's never like, it can be immediate, but if you want to look deeper in processing the trauma, in processing the situation, you always need time to reflect on it, right? So now I think is the most interesting phase. Like I think it's horrible for everyone to be in this, but apart from the blooming, how the artist actually started to make more and more, like apart from the quantity, now becomes the quality also. And I'm not talking about the artistic quality, I'm talking about the quality of the reflection of the thought which follows. And also a lot of people from the artistic practice, they started to acknowledge like what the imperialistic system did to us. And because it was like, yeah, we're independent, everything is fine, we can create, we can do, we can make cartoons, we can self-express. But then by acknowledging that we've been victims for such a long time, which like Ukrainians don't like to be victims, I must say. Like that's true, right? Like we laugh about situation, we say like we fight, we have this resilience, but yeah, the same as like not anyone. Yeah, I think like the majority of the people I met, they don't really want to be named refugees. They don't want to be felt as victims, and the same for the artists. Like we have a freedom of creation. But now I think more and more artists, they started to process this like imperialistic culture, how was it, like somewhere on the level of subconscious, how it influenced, because we never thought about it in this way. So now I think that will be the main, like the most interesting point when it will be a switch, like it's already happening. And what I'm waiting the most, of course, is also like the works that take the most of the time. And I'm talking now about like cinematic field. Because for instance, my friend director, she's based in Amsterdam as well. So she started the documentary a long time ago, and then she's been working with the character from Kharkiv. As it sometimes happens to documentary, you start with the idea, you have the script, more or less, but then, of course, the documentary takes its own path, and then the story changes, and then you have to follow. So what happened after the 24th of February, my friend, director, she had to pick up her refugee character from the border in Poland, and then she said, like, I have no idea what my documentary is about anymore. It's something else. So I'm like really curious, and it's just one story among like so many of them. I'm really waiting to see those movies because it will be like so sincere, so truthful, and that will be the story of the people, but also with so many layers, because it will be, if you would imagine like how many countries in Europe have been now with the people with such stories, and then the documentaries were shot in Poland, in Germany, in the Netherlands, or like in all of them, all of that countries, because sometimes the characters, they just move around, and then the directors and the crew, they were just following them. So I think that will be a really interesting moment also to see what will happen. And also the more theoretical approach, the more conceptual approach, which combines the academia studies, like artists also like taking part of that and experience that the academia started to share it even more. And then like we're talking about the colonialism, not from the Russian perspective, like we're talking about the Ukraine, not from the Russian perspective, we talk about Ukraine from our perspective and from European perspective, but not taking the point of view which was always used. So then I think in art, it will be all reflected, which makes me really happy, but also sad, because we had like for such a price.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was also like listening to you, and was also thinking about actually Second World War, because it was also another time when many writers and artists, they were like facing incredible difficulty, and also like how does an artist or a writer like reflects on his own work during a time of war, and especially when the artist or writer is on the side of the oppressed. I mean, I was also thinking about. It's very difficult to reflect. There is like some time. I mean, like Walter Benjamin, he just wrote probably one of his masterpiece work just before he took his life, because he was being deported from Spain back to the Nazi fronts, and that's when he wrote his last masterpiece, and probably his best work that we're still studying today, and which help us to reflect not only on that time, but also like the time in which we live. So my question to you is like, since you're connected to Ukrainian artists and you also have the chance to talk to them, do you see, how do you think at this moment you say like this documentary filmmaker who doesn't actually know clearly what she's making now, or maybe knows, but still maybe she would actually speak up in her work than with her words. I don't know. But I would actually like to hear from you, because this is a very, very important time for the world, and the Ukrainian artist and the writer. Do you think they are being able to reflect now, or would be like being able to reflect more in the future and help us expand our thought about this kind of historical situation?
I think it works for everyone differently. Like for me, for instance, I'm not the socially proactive artist, right? So I never created something which would be direct reflection on the political situation. The art is always political, right? But some of us creating something which is touching the theoretical part of like what is art and how you perceive the artwork. What is it to make an artwork? As for my personal research. So for me, it was for a long time just a problem even to start making something because I thought it's not important anymore. Like I have to produce something which is really connected, which is more direct and which will reflect on the situation. But I think I do agree with Maria, for instance, about like, first of all, you have to continue with something that you already like specializing in, right? Because art is also such a broad word. I also think that anything which goes on the edge is also art, right? Like the music, and like it could be like so many different forms, and writing, the literature, right? I think as art is really political, it will be reflected, but sometimes we shouldn't look for really figurative approach to art. There will be some forms that you think, like it shouldn't be named Ukrainian artist, resilience, war, and using all this word, which is obviously, it should be the first phase of the situation, right? Like the first few months. But what I'm pointing to, like, if you will pay attention to what will happen to the literature, it shouldn't be directly about war, but it will be reflected, and it will be so like subtly mentioned, or like even not mentioned in the war. The characters which will be in the books, in the novels, which will be, which I think, like a lot of artists that I know for now, they also writing something new. That would be the most interesting thing. The dialogue about colonial studies in art, that will happen, of course, and it will be also a really nice dialogue between the colonial studies in Europe or in US and the colonial studies in Ukraine, right? So it will take so many different directions, like everywhere, like music, right? So you shouldn't write a song about some resilience or sorry, some resistance to make it like to touch you, right? But sometimes it will be told in a different ways, and the story will be not told directly, but you can feel it. And sometimes just the date will make sense for you because you know when the music was created, or when the illustration was done, or like when the book was written. Like some people are writing books somewhere in the basements, and it cannot be left aside. It will influence the piece. It will be really deep enrooted in the creations.
Thank you. As you said, it is already like enrooted. Yeah. In the, but thank you. I actually don't have more question. But if you would like to add something, please do. Otherwise, we'd move to a Q&A session if there's any questions from the audience.
Yeah, maybe from the part of being an artist, I'm like really, really thankful for people who does representation of Ukrainian artists in different forms, making the publication, making the installation, give an award to Ukrainian artists. This is amazing support, because sometimes it's not about even housing, it's not about giving food, about giving chance to speak to Ukrainian artists, to give them space to show, to produce, to work. It's just so amazing. I'm thankful literally for, like, to every institution in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, everywhere in the Netherlands, small and big, who does this work daily, continue. And nevertheless, there are like a lot of things was said like, oh, but maybe public is already tired of Ukrainian art. Seriously, I heard it so many times. So I think that it's amazing that people like this institution, like Ronald, like they have this power inside, like keep going, keep helping. It's amazing. I'm really thankful.
No, thank you. Obviously, we in the New West are not tired at all. So I would actually like to ask the audience if any of you have any question to our guest today. Oh, okay, okay. There is no longer any schedule there for the last half an hour, actually. The monitor. Yeah, yeah, that's all right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the guest, to all the guests, for for this very, very important discussion. It was very illuminating for me, and I guess for everyone else. Thank you very much. Until I see you guys next time.